Okay, good evening, everyone. Good afternoon, Professor Susan. Thank you so much to be here with us. Let me introduce very shortly the bio of Professor Susan Ariel Aaronson. She's a professor of Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. It's a very prestigious, very famous graduate program of international affairs, international relations. She is director of Digital Trade and Data Governance Hub and principal investigator of a national science foundation called Trustworthy AI Institute for Law and Society, where she directs on data and AI governance.
The sound is gone. I can't hear you guys anymore. Hi, can you hear me? Hi, somehow we lost the sound. Can you hear me? Can you guys hear me?
Hello, I hear you. I think
I can't hear
people are
them.
here. Yeah,
Can
I
they
think
hear?
it's okay, the audio.
Okay. Hola, everyone. So thank you so much for the opportunity. Can you hear me? Thanks very much for the opportunity to talk about this. So this paper will be out in January, and it's a paper about how basically policymakers around the world have failed to govern the data for generative AI and why that is important. So let's begin. And please feel free to interrupt me at any time if you have any questions or if I'm not clear. So basically, the paper is about the thought that, you know, in the past, right, we have had multiple sources of information, and that still is true. And yet increasingly people are relying on AI chatbots, and I'm only talking about large language models, have become the place where people seek information and create information. Now, we don't have any reliable statistics on this, but we know that OpenAI has more than 200 million users, and there are many, many other chatbots that are also widely used, from Falcon in the UAE to Chinese models from Alibaba and other companies. So there are two key things I'd like to communicate here. That many of these systems are proprietary and opaque, so you can't really replicate these systems. And without replication, it's pretty hard to build trust that these systems are really trustworthy. They're built on two sources of data, right? Proprietary data, and that proprietary data can be personal data, it can be data that they bought or data collected by the firm, and then web scraped data. And firms are often vague about the provenance of that data and the integrity of that data. And basically what I'm trying to argue here is that there are a lot of companies producing large language models and creating chatbots But basically, the largest platforms are producing these large language models because they have the computing power, the expertise, and the data sets to build, explain, and improve these models. So that worries me because that means that the data giants, Facebook, Google, etc., Microsoft, are gaining ever more control over data. And I think that's worrisome just because I think in the world we should have multiple sources of trusted information. But let's see what you think. And again, interrupt me at any time if you have a question. I appreciate it. Okay, so we know the best statistics that I can say is that we know there's at least 300 million people around the world. And, you know, since the world has 8 billion people, maybe that doesn't sound like that much to you, but it still is quite a bit. A large statistic are getting their information from these chatbots, right? And I did not mean to do that. And so some of them are open, and openness and close is it's on a continuum, right? So firms can be totally open about their large language models, and some firms are not. And because these data sets can be inaccurate, incomplete, or unrepresentative, these chatbots can hallucinate. Which is a term I'm sure everybody knows, but basically it means the chatbot is making up things or providing incorrect information. And by not governing the data that underpins these large language models adequately, governments are stimulating, and the large language models themselves are stimulating what we call data disquiet, which is people are getting concerned about their data being used. And when I say their data, I just don't mean personal data, but data that people create, alter, etc. Okay, so let's look at some statistics about generative AI in the world. The market is huge and it's growing. Some 73% of all generative AI firms are in the US and China. And these countries not only lead on AI, but they control data collection through their control of platform services, submarine cables, satellites, data storage, right through the cloud, etc. Okay, and again, it's important to note that the firms creating large language models for sale to other firms or to individuals, these firms often use open source methods, but they rely on an international trade term called trade secrets to protect their algorithms and to control and reuse the data that they analyze. So when I say trade secrets, that is the funniest term, but it really is true, because if you claim your algorithm is protected by a trade secret, you never need to share it with anybody unless you're challenged that that algorithm copy somebody else's. And, you know, trade secrets are used for all sorts of intellectual property protection. And the most famous example of this would be Coke's formula, Coca-Cola's formula for the soda, right? It is the secret sauce. But I worry that dominations of these platforms are going to lead to a perception that generative AI markets and data markets are unfair. And I think that generative AI is going to enhance these concerns, despite the fact that several governments, and I'm just citing as example, the UAE, France, and Germany, they have established, they don't mandate it, but they have created data sets, and they're trying to establish federally funded large language models and large language model chatbots. So let me just stop here and ask, does anyone have any questions or concerns about this background? Okie dokie, I'll keep going. Okay, so to understand AI, right, any form of AI, not just large language models, we need to talk about data. And data is something different from any other good or service, right? And the reason it is different is because, first of all, it's easy. It's cheap to store. It's easy to move across borders. It's easy to share, but increasingly hoarded by governments and firms. It can simultaneously be a commercial asset and a public good. And that makes it extraordinarily difficult to govern. Some data sets are essential to national security and economic growth. And just to give you a quick example of that, you may all know the athletic platform Strava. The athletic platform Strava in 2014 published a heat map of where its users are located. And the heat map had a number of biking and runners in Syria, in places in Syria in a time of war. And that led to the revelation that there were US and Australian and other countries' bases in Syria that nobody had known about before, or at least were not known to many people. So sometimes when you have a data set, it can have national security consequences, and people just don't think about that. And then one thing that's become very clear to me, and I'd be keen to know what you all think of this, but when we're talking about generative AI, and yet we have governance of data by type, not by use. I'm not saying that it should be, but I'm just, I want people to think about it. It's not done by the use or by the objective. Like, why do you want to share this data? Why do you want to use this data? By governing it by type, almost everything when it's mixed becomes a form of personal data. And I think that can be a problem. And it makes it harder to share and reuse data. And that could be a problem for AI at some point. And I guess it is surprising to me when I think about this, but so far there's been very little concern of the concentration and control of data by large language model chatbots, but we can see them already supplanting your browser or enhancing your browser. And if you use ChatGPT 3.5 or 4, it is now, you can use it with Bing. It's called Bing Chat. And, it gives you up-to-date data. It combines the web with the data set for ChatGPT. But, is that a good thing as more and more people seek information? Something to think about, I think. Okay. So now let's go directly into the evidence of the paper, which is what is the data supply chain for generative AI? So as I hinted before, the first part of it is proprietary data. And so that can include data protected by trade secrets or other forms of intellectual property protection, IPR, and then data collected or purchased by the AI designer or deployer. So that can include web scrape data, which can include proprietary data, personal data, and open source data. And when I talk about open source data, I mean data that is open to the public with little to no requirements regarding its reuse. So that can include, until recently, Reddit, Wikipedia, Brazilian government sites, US government sites, etc. So that's a very diverse pool of data. Okay. So there are some questions that arise out of this. And the first is, how does web scraping affect copyrighted data? How does web scraping affect individuals and groups who are supposed to be protected under privacy law or personal data protection law, but they're not, as we've seen with so much personal data we know is included in training large language models? How web scraping reveals the lack of protection for content creators. So if you're on Reddit, which is a discussion site where you can ask questions. Hey, what's the best hotel to stay in Rio de Janeiro or Rehoboth Beach, Delaware, right? And then another question is, how is the debate over open and closed large language model reveal the lack of clear and universal rules to govern the quality and validity of data sets? And that is the question that interests me the most. And the reason it interests me the most is because in good science, we say that findings should not be published until they are replicable, right? And that means that you can take the data and, test the findings and replicate the findings. And yet we cannot do this with most forms of AI. Obviously, there are other things that we need to do, but many scientists have raised questions about it because if people are going to these chatbots to learn science, for example, to ask questions like, will chemotherapy cause all my hair to come out? Or what does protein folding look like? They should have some guarantee that the data that is provided is correct. Okay, so this is a listing which anyone can take of 3 different companies and where their papers are regarding their data set and what they said about it. And if you were to read the paper, I don't want to go into too much detail about it, but I show that 2 things happen. Thing 1 is over time, every designer of generative AI, large language models, has become less transparent about the sources of data that they have, whether they're open or closed. They might share the data in their open source, but they don't talk about it that much. And the reason they don't do that, one can hypothesize and say they don't do that because they're very afraid of being sued because they took copyrighted or personal data without direct consent. So the paper goes through all of that. I won't bore you with that, but it is distressing. And then I discuss how governments respond. And I won't go through all this. You can see this, but governments are doing piecemeal things. For example, Italy initially banned, and then it rescinded a ban on ChatGPT. So it basically said, this company cannot provide generative AI to users. Many companies have opened investigations, in particular into ChatGPT, but some barred as well. China put forward very explicit rules governing generative AI and the data sets it can use when it faces consumers. The FTC in the United States is investigating OpenAI. I would say that generative AI and foundation models, concerns about that really influence the EU AI Act. So those are just some of these examples. So it's not that governments aren't acting, but they're not acting in a systemic manner that reflects the systems that underpin large language models that are used for generative AI chatbots. Okay. Does anyone have any thoughts about this or questions?
Usually at the end we have questions, okay?
Okay, that's fine. I just, I'm very, this is how I teach. I like it to be as interactive as possible. So I appreciate that. Okay, so let's review. So if we were to summarize what governments are doing, first they've paid attention to the enforcement problems, right? So copyrighted and personal data, that's how they've responded. But they haven't really addressed the governance gaps. And again, those governance gaps are people who create content on open websites like Reddit or Wikipedia, right, where they're not compensated for their work, they have no protections, but their data, what they did there is their labor. So that's something to think about, right? Because that is the most desired content for LLMs, according to many LLM designers. Okay, so that's one thing. Another thing is there's no way to ensure that those data sets are accurate, complete, and representative. Now, let's be honest. No data set can be fully accurate, complete, and representative because, right, we all develop theories, we develop models to try to represent the real world, and they are hopefully as accurate as possible, but they may not be, completely perfect. But this is so far from perfect. And the reason we know that is because there are so many hallucinations, right? And all of these companies admit this, yet governments have done very little to address this problem. So let me repeat this again. More and more people, including myself, utilize generative AI chatbots, right, to make their lives easier, to come up with a story for their children every night, to organize a data set, etc., right? But we have no way of knowing that the data set is accurate, complete, and as representative as possible. So let me put it in another way. We can admit that the data sets are inaccurate, incomplete, and biased. And so that's point 2 of the governance gaps. And then there's no formal protections regarding the reuse of data. And that really worries me because we all tout AI as something that can help us mitigate wicked problems, right? So for Brazil, that might be the erosion or the death of the rainforest. And for Africa, that might be, pandemics such as Ebola. And for the United States and Canada, it's deforestation and forest fires, right? So we need to make sure that AI can meet its promise. And that means we need to pay more attention. Now, I don't think governments can ever mandate that you have accurate, complete, and representative data sets, but they should encourage it, incentivize it. Okay, so again, what's inadequate about this? Data is type sufficient right now, right? We don't judge it by its use or the objective for using it. I'm not saying it should change, but I am saying we should be thinking about this, right? Secondly, web scraping is based on scraping the global internet. Everybody is not online, that's fine. But by definition, it is not accurate, complete, and representative. And you need to have as many people online and as possible rules regarding the free flow of data to get better web scraping, right? So that's something that policymakers are going to need to address. They have done nothing about data sharing or replicating results. They have done nothing about content providers and creators, okay? And the result of that might be that more and more policymakers look at this and say, gee, should I share my country's data or should I share governmental data? And also, some policymakers are making a choice. Not that many, I think, but we do know that China, as example, does web scrape, but when it builds generative AI, and it is because there is censorship, China's chatbots are widely considered to be even more inaccurate because so much of the information is censored. And China's priority is it wants to have social stability, and that is why it has the Great Firewall. That is why it censors data coming in. But without a broader data set, it is very difficult to ensure that that data is accurate, complete, and representative. Okay. And that's a problem, right? I'm worried about if more and more people turn to these chatbots for information, that is going to be a concern. Look, right, when you go into Twitter or you go to the New York Times, even the world's best newspapers, best sources of news can make mistakes. But the amount of mistakes are much rarer. There is a checking system. There is a form of accountability. And we have not got that yet. And I don't see why we're not demanding it. And when I say we, I mean users, designers, developers, content providers, content creators, us. Okay. Okay, so then, so what does that mean? There's going to be some real problems. Generative AI is not going to meet its potential. As I said before, it could be without intent an indirect disincentive, I wrote that wrong, because we want to have more open science. We want more data sharing. But if people are afraid that their data is going to be misused or misrepresented, they're not going to share. On the other hand, it could facilitate more access to open data because more people may demand that it be corrected. So this is not necessarily a horrible thing. I hope that it will prod scientists, developers, designers, and deployers to think more about data governance and data provenance, which could lead to better data standards and better use of data. That's my hope. I'm not, it's not clear. And then, I'm very worried about scientists. For some reason, lately, I've done a lot of the same sort of talks with scientists. And scientists, at least in the United States and Europe, I know that they are demanding greater accountability because their work is being misrepresented. So, another thing is that there hasn't been any sort of thoughts about this systemically, that AI is a system, and right now data flows are governed under trade agreements, but they say very little about the system underpinning AI. And in fact, they say very little about AI and data sharing and data reuse. And the thing is, we want more developing country people to be online so that their data and their science and their information can be better represented online, right? And so we need to encourage them to participate in talks about web scraping and about the free flow of data. And what other bodies should govern this? How should we govern this? But I don't see that happening yet. So what would a systemic approach look like? So first, a systemic approach mimics the technology. It can evolve over time as a system evolves, right? But it has to recognize the multidimensional nature of data, which means that the same data can simultaneously be a public good, a commercial asset, as I said before. And the system of governance is going to have to be flexible. Now, many people say the answer to this is technological, right? So right now, what are the technologies that we have in place? So the first thing is synthetic data sets, right? But the problem with synthetic data sets, if let's say they're created at Hugging Face or Microsoft, in general, those synthetic data sets are not shared because they are proprietary and they belong to the company. Without sharing them, we can't test them for their accuracy, completeness, and representativeness. So I don't see synthetic data as an answer to this problem. One thing that might help is to require firms to do more and say more about the data that underpins their models. And so right now, they can say things like, we web scraped the data on February 3rd, 2023. And so our model is up to date to that point. And, 27% of our data came from Wikipedia, and, X amount came from this source, et cetera. But I still think that doesn't tell you very much. And so many people think the answer is to watermark the data, and that might be helpful, another technical solution. But I think the first step is for people need to understand the role that their data, whether it's personal data or data that they created or data that is about them, underpins this technology. And they need to have more voice. And that is why the NSF Trustworthy AI Institute, we focus so much on participatory models for AI. I will be delighted to diss the problems with participatory models if you would like. But I will now just finish up my presentation and thank you for hearing me out. And I really welcome your comments.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Susan. We're going to open the floor for questions here. Professor Marcelo.
Can you hear me?
Yes, hi.
Thank you very much for your talk, very interesting. I have a question. There has been a shift in the way programming is done, because previously it was all free, so you had the free programming language, free libraries, open source, whatever, until GPT-3, and now everything's closed. So the freedom was kind of had a multiplying effect, made things accelerate very much. And now that all the models are owned by a few players and they are hidden, we don't know anymore what's inside, and this can also block the development of the technology. So
it can go either way. I have access to a paper which I can share online, which is an overview of all the open source models. There are quite a few open source models, though. Let me see if this is it. I don't think that's it, but I can send you the link to that. I think there are 34 open source models right now, but you're right to say that more and more the trend is towards proprietary, because there's going to be so much money in making generative AI chatbots for various sectors. I would disagree with your premise, though. There was a time when everything was open source, because there always was that mix. Right? Some programming languages were closed source, right? IBM and Microsoft. Some software was closed source, right? Then you had Red Hat, and I think there was a change, but it wasn't, would you call it that significant? You ended up with a mix, but it's never been fully, it's always been a continuum, right?
The big push in AI happened in the open, so to speak.
Right. And then they became closed, which shows their hypocrisy. But France and Germany have long been pushing, and France has funded quite a bit of open source models, and same with Dubai. So I don't know if that'll make the change, because I don't know anybody who uses Falcon. It comes up great on the tests. It performs great on the tests, but most people don't use generative AI because it performs great on the test. They want to see, can it answer the kind of questions that I want to ask or do the kind of tasks I want it to do? So, you know, in general, I worry about this development, and it does seem difficult because there is, in the United States and Europe, I don't know if this is true in Brazil, but this argument that open source is more dangerous because it is easy to insert code. All this, you know, I'm not telling you anything you don't know. The US government, in the US executive order on AI, an arm of the Department of Commerce has asked for public comment on the safety of open source foundational AI models. So that call will be coming out in January, and I think there's a lot of discussion about this. But I would say, from the point of view of human rights, efficiency, and better AI, open source models seem to make the most sense, unless we want a world dominated by Microsoft, OpenAI, Google, etc. So it, to me, is a more democratic and accountable approach than that adopted by those companies. But, you know, Facebook's model, Facebook likes to say that it is open source, but they have not been transparent about the data sets.
Professor Souza, so thank you for the excellent lecture. I have a specific question. So recently, the European Union approved some version of the EU Act, which is still to be discussed. But I would like to know if you have thoughts on this. Do you think it's appropriate? Do you think it's enough? Maybe it's not enough. Maybe you have comments on the European Act.
Well, it's I had a interesting chat. So we had this conference called Data Governance in the Age of Generative AI, and one of the speakers at the conference was the EU official responsible for the AI Act. He was kind enough to come, even though the negotiations were going on at the final negotiations. And here's what he told me, if I can share it, which is that basically it's not done. And what really matters is how it is regulated. Will there be a new body created? Will the 27 member states have to enforce, you know, the rules as put in place? What do they mean by data nutrition labels? So those are the type of questions that are still quite unclear. What do they mean by how you present data provenance, et cetera? But there was this sense, he also told me, that you know, the Germans and the French were going to do everything they could to sabotage the process because they were so angry over the language on foundation models. And you probably all read about that in the news. I guess if your question is, do I like this approach to regulation? I don't know what to say, because there are so many ways you can regulate AI, right? You can regulate the technology. You can regulate the risk. You can regulate the data. You can regulate the business practices. And the EU, because of its approach, precautionary approach, has made a decision that we're going to regulate the technology based on risk. And I guess there has been this argument that that approach is not systemic, right? Because it can't respond to the changes in types of AI. And the changes wrought by generative AI have been so fast, I don't think any government can keep up. So that's why I believe that we need to regulate the data. since that is a key input, I don't want to say the key input, because computing power really matters a lot. In the United States, this is a misuse of a word, but there is a law that is not a bill that will likely become law because it's supported by both Democrats and Republicans and the White House, and it's called the Create AI Act. And the idea behind that is that we need to create a resource that provides computing, highest speed computing and cloud capacity to all researchers, independent, university, community college, high school. So we provide the compute as a infrastructure, which is something I love, and open source data sets. And so, okay, then you have incentives for competition, and you have incentives for using those data sets and sharing those data sets because they're open and can be widely used. So it's an incentive-based approach. I would add to that the, what I've suggested, which is, I'll diss my own recommendation, which is I think firms should be required to report on the data that they use. If I wanted to regulate anything, I would regulate the business practices, not the technology. That I think misuse of personal data, misuse of technologies is much more of a problem than regulating the high risk and existential risk of AI. I'm sorry for the long-winded answer, but that's my opinion. I wouldn't go where the EU has gone. What do you think?
Thank you.
Any questions? Claudia, and then Claudia, you start.
So, thank you, Professor Susan. I was listening to what you said, and at the same time I was thinking, well, Google has been doing all that, every single issue that you mentioned, since '96 with search. It collects data that we don't share. I mean, especially in the beginning, so much hallucination from Google search. For those of us who are old enough to remember how bad that thing was. Okay, all those problems, and I was going through every single issue. It's true for Google search. And we are using it for 27 years. And you're okay with that? And it survived every legal challenge that people tried in terms of data. So what's different with generative AI from Google search? I don't see the difference. I think if we wanted to regulate data, it will have to include Google search. There's no way out. But do you want to do that?
When I say regulate data,
let's say
what I mean, I shouldn't say regulate data, govern data, right? So there's many different strategies for regulation, just as there's many different types of regulation. And I'm a big believer that greater transparency is in itself a form of regulation. But I agree with you. In the end, firms can lie about being transparent, right? It's not perfect. But right now, data markets are opaque. We don't know who's buying and selling data. We don't know what data firms are buying and selling. But rather than regulate, let's say, data brokers or the sale of data, we need to understand better from an economics point of view that market before we decide how to regulate it. But I don't see policymakers doing anything to make it less opaque. But I would like to see that first. I think this is a real problem, the opacity. And to me, it reminds me very much, I used to work on corruption. And it very much reminds me of that, because you could never address corruption without addressing opacity. And, that's one of the reasons that Brazil's approach, you're going to laugh when I say this, but in class, I would always tout Brazil's approach of using data mining to look at policymakers, let's say in the Congress, where they were putting their money. And that would allow you to see, this member of Congress has 2 million real that is not their salary. Where did that come from? So I think you've got to start with incentives towards transparency, because I don't want to alter the innovation potential of AI. And I don't have any good answers beyond that. Because I guess, you know, if you study science and technology governance, you know, the OECD does the bulk of work in this area, and they're always saying, why can't nations come up with a systemic approach that reflects the complexity of the systems? But the problem is that nations have different ethical approaches to the systems, right? In Korea, it's just fine to use stem cells to try to create a new human being. Same in China. That's just not allowable in the United States. So how are we going to get to that place? And we have to get to that place globally, because these are global systems and no one nation can regulate it sufficiently.
Okay, Susan, thank you. You have more questions?
Hi, Susan. Thank you for...
Come closer.
Hi, Susan. Thank you for your talk. I really love the thing you said, that if we don't have ethics in business, we cannot have ethics in, you know, what comes from it. But yesterday, I'd like to know from you, because yesterday we were discussing about using ChatGPT in education, and someone brought up the thing that there is a cognitive problem maybe of using ChatGPT and basic education, and then people can get used to automation in terms of thought, like in this pattern, automated pattern, as people got used to calculator and things like that. And I'd like to know if you know some discussions about neural rights and possible cognitive problems in using, and me particularly, I'm working more in terms of inclusion, and we talk also about epistemology and how we need to have a diversity of thought inside those systems, otherwise they can direct people too much to one type of thought or one type of understanding knowledge. So I don't know if you know if there are some discussions about the use of ChatGPT in education and some concerns people are bringing up. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I have thought about this a bit, and I do discuss it in the paper, because more and more educators are concerned about it, but they also can see enormous benefits. So I would call this cognitive liberty. And I'm more concerned about it for XR, which is, you know, dependent on AI. But, you know, in virtual worlds, people find it very difficult to distinguish between what is real and what is manipulated. And this is why we have to regulate the business practices. I'm not saying that regulating the risk is wrong, but if firms are using these technologies to subliminally sell you products or convince you that Brexit is a good thing or Donald Trump was a great president, that is extremely dangerous. And propaganda and advertising and disinformation have been with us for forever. And it is clear that, you know, if firms are creating this technology, they may misuse it for educational purposes. So I'm worried too. but I can also see huge benefits because people learn in different ways and at different purposes. And lots of teachers have said, and if you would like, I can send you something that is kind of a debate about this that I found quite interesting. I cited in the paper. You know, for tutoring purposes, it could be fabulous because it can tailor the learning strategy to the user. So if you learn best visually, the latest iterations of, let's say, ChatGPT can teach you how a chemical reaction takes place, maybe using pictures rather than verbally. So I think its potential as a tool for teachers is going to be absolutely great, especially in large classes where you might have like 3 students that, you know, can move at a very fast pace, whereas the bulk of the class moves more slowly. I really think it is going to be a great tool, and I would bet almost all of you will agree with me. But if we don't govern it correctly, and again, I don't know the answer to that, the how, I do see the gaps, but the how, no one really knows how to do this, because what we're really governing is, as sort of, as you point out, is access to the information that makes us a civilization. And should that be created by a few giant companies? I hope not. But I don't want to squelch them from innovating. Did that answer your question? Was that helpful?
You please send me. We have an echo.
More questions? Christina and you. We have more questions, Susan.
Hi, Susan. Thank you for your presentation. Nice to talk to you again. We talked last week. Susan, I would like to know if the government needs to have a special look at the judicial data. Why I'm asking this? Because, for example, here in Brazil, Santos has a lot of sensitive personal data, and the personal data as the name, surname, the address, the ID, and the other kinds of discussions in the sentence. And the people are scraping this data, and we don't know how companies will work with all this data, personal data, because we have a public sentence because we wanted that the citizen control the judicial power. This is a democratic principle that we need to ensure in the country. But on the other hand, for example, if we anonymize this data, we are trying to protect people's personal data. So how we could have a special look for this, and how we could regulate this kind of data without having a democratic problem, you know, because it's very important to ensure this public sentence and this kind of judicial data. Thank you again.
Yeah, my gut is the United States will have a personal data protection law, but it will be after the presidential election. I think we're, you know, just as Brazil was in for an existential vote, it's going to be hugely consequential. And there are just things that are not going to get done in the Congress, in the US Congress, and regulating AI and protecting personal data. That's just not going to happen, I don't think, before November 2024. But the US government can do a lot and is already doing a lot regarding regulating personal data. So the FTC has said, first, that it has all the authority that it needs to regulate use of consumer data for AI. And you are starting to see it bring open investigations and bring court cases against companies' misuse of data. So that's what I'd call the disincentive to it. Firms are also starting to compete, although we don't see this yet for generative AI, on protection of personal data. Although all of that may be bullshit, you know, it may be image making, greenwashing, that kind of thing, as opposed to really being real. But I do think that there is so much global pressure in the world because data is yourself, whether it's sensory data or whether it is information about your voting habits or your income. And so I think there are a lot of ways that these things are regulated, both globally, right? You know, the EU is just so big. The EU plus Brazil alone is an awful lot of people. And I think we've calculated that almost, you know, so I run a think tank that maps the governance of data. And I think we found that 67 countries alone, that's about 98% of the world's data, personal data, has these rules. The problem is they're not adequately enforced. And I would put the EU in there. Can't speak for Brazil's approach, but it's one thing to have a law in the books. It has to be adequately enforced. So, but I think the United States is moving in the right direction in terms of we are starting to understand how dangerous these companies can be because we're starting to understand that large pools of data, whether it includes personal data or not, are both a wonderful thing and a dangerous thing. And so that means that governments are starting to wake up that they need to have some sort of strategy for data's role in society, and then they need to move beyond a strategy towards policies. And so it's quite one thing to have an AI strategy. I think we found 42 nations have an AI strategy, but something like only 14 of them actually have a strategy for data to be used in the economy. You know, many countries have like, we have a strategy for data created or funded by the government, but when that data is mixed with personal data, how can it be utilized and how should it be protected, et cetera? So, you know, I want to see countries think about this, and that'll lead countries to think about it. I misspoke. Can I say that again? I want to see companies think about it, and that will lead more countries and policymakers to think about it. But the fact that the United States doesn't have this law means that we are not a shining example on the hill in the United States.
Thank you, Susan. We have a question from the virtual audience, and I move to you.
So, okay.
That's a great question. That is a great question. I can see it.
Large language model used for learning. There are terabytes of data. Not even the companies that want the LLM knows for sure what is in the data sets they use.
That's not completely true. I mean, they do know what the web scrape looks like, and then they filter the data, right? So they have more information than they're revealing about their data sets. It's true. These are huge data sets, right? But if the data is watermarked, first of all, you know that there is a script called robots.txt that is on, you know, you can put it on almost any website, and it says that my data cannot be scraped or my data can be scraped for a fee. Okay, and more owners, deployers of websites use that technical solution. Okay, but watermarking is another way, but watermarking is not perfect. Watermarks can be faked, etc. But I think firms know a lot more about their data than I think you're saying. But I agree with you. These are terabytes of data. At the same time, they're also using widely explored data sets like Wikipedia, like Google's .patent. And so they also know a lot about those desirable, widely scraped data sets. So I'm not sure I agree with I know I don't agree with your premise, but I agree with what's underpinning your premise, which is, you know, these companies should be more upfront about the data, and they should be more, we should incentivize them more to enforce and pay for the data that they use. But my only concern there is that web scraping has existed for more than 20 years, about 27 years. People have scraped the web to get a sense of where it's going, its health, etc. And I don't want to stop web scraping, right? Web scraping should not be banned. We need to find other ways to sample the web, in a sense, to get the data. And one way to do it is to pay for the data. So in a paper I wrote, I called the Wicked Problems Agency, that would, you know, create LLMs by renting data and paying sources of data for their data. The problem is, how do you accurately price that? You know, creating a market for that could be quite helpful. That is not opaque like the ones that data brokers currently have, but is open air. What do you think?
A last question here.
Hi, Susan. First, thank you for the lecture. And are you listening to me? Okay, thank you. We know that LLMs also, besides the data, it's extremely important. They're sensitive to the fine-tuning that you put afterwards. For example, GPT-4, a few months after they started raising some possible lawsuits, became a little more resistant to talking about copyrighted material that it shouldn't be able to have access to. And that was all because of the fine-tuning and not the data of the mainstream task training. So I'd like to ask you, what are possible ways we can monitor or reconcile monitoring the data with the fine-tuning that they're doing on top of it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we should incentivize companies to make that both all levels of data filtering to be transparent, and data use when you're pre-training, and then any form of final checks of the model. What data did they use? Also, it is very unclear to me. Here's another question maybe you can answer. I've gotten 4 or 5 different answers to this question. Are prompts included in the data set so that it then changes the model? Like right now, OpenAI says, no, the data set used is only, let's say, what we built it on, and I'm making this up, of our last iteration of GP4. And I'm making up this date, but let's say that date was April 2023. But I've heard that sometimes the data set is now enhanced to include the questions people are asking, but that in turn can taint the data set because it is reuse of lots of the same data. So I don't know the answer to that question, but I do think that one way around it is to get greater transparency of every level of data use. But that's going to make it more expensive, and only the biggest firms will be able to do that. So what I'm suggesting has a downside to it too, right? And this is another reason why I think governments, and this is a problem, you know, if you have to choose between feeding and educating your people and providing research funding, you know, probably the choice should be feeding and educating. But rich countries can afford to invest in creating public shared data sets and publicly shared computer resources.
Thank you, Professor Susan. Thank you for your kindness to deliver this lecture today, this evening here. We all wish a happy new year. Yeah, we're going to celebrate the end of the year, this hot year of artificial intelligence.
wish you were here with us.
Me too.
Okay, very kind.
Thank you so much. It was an honor to speak with you. And if anybody has any further questions or thoughts on my paper on how to improve it, please give me an email, and you can reach me at saaronso@gwu.edu. Thank you so much for coming today, and thank you so much for welcoming me.
Okay, we keep in touch for future collaboration, okay? Thank you so much.
See you later.